Hi, everyone. I'm Carter Foster. I'm Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs and Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Blanton Museum of Art at the University of Texas at Austin. And welcome to our second curated conversation. We're doing these every Tuesday at 5 for happy hour, hopefully, so I hope you have a drink. Tonight's conversation is called A Woman's Place is in the Canon, Recent Acquisitions by Female Artists. And I'm joined by my colleague, Holly Borham, who is the Assistant Curator of Prints and Drawings and who I work with closely. And we'll be answering questions, your questions about these acquisitions. So you can ask questions about any of the artists, or if you have an interest in knowing more about the acquisition process and how museums decide what to bring into their collection, you can feel free to ask anything about that. Holly's going to start off by giving a presentation about the artists we're going to feature today, and then I'm going to give you a few housekeeping rules. Your audio is muted, so we can't hear you if you speak. So we ask that you do all your questions in the Q&A window and not in the chat window. So please use that. We'll be reading the questions from there, and I think that's it. This is happy hour, so we propose that you make a Manhattan because Helen Frankenthaler was a diehard New Yorker, and that seemed like a good drink. But I hope you're drinking something, and we'll get started. Here you go, Holly.
Well, welcome everyone. It is so nice to see these participants joining us from near and far. And as Carter said, we're really excited to talk to you about some great new works that we've added to our collection this year. And you know, the question of how do we decide what to acquire, sort of the quick and dirty on that is that we acquire great works of art. And sometimes those works are ones that we have had our eye on for a while, and sometimes are ones that we kind of go hunting for. But either way, you know, we're looking for great works, and oftentimes by artists, sometimes it's artists that we have in our collection already, and sometimes it's by ones that we haven't had the chance to collect yet. So I'm Curator of Prints and Drawings, and we have about 16,000 works on paper, meaning prints, drawings, and photographs in our collection. And that might sound like a lot, but we are always looking to grow our collection and expand the story that we can tell about the history of art. And oftentimes that does mean looking for artists who have previously been overlooked. And in many cases, those are female artists. So we're going to begin by looking at the earliest work that we added to our collection this year, meaning chronologically earliest. And that is by an artist named Elisabetta Sirani. And what you see on your screen here is actually one sheet of paper, front and back. And we have a drawing here of Mary Magdalene venerating a crucifix. And so I'll just tell you a little bit about Elisabetta Sirani to begin with, and then we'll talk about this drawing specifically. And then we'll kind of open it up for questions before we move on to our next three artists. So Elisabetta Sirani we're sort of heading back to mid-17th century Bologna. She was born in 1638, and she became one of the most important Bolognese artists of the mid-17th century. Her biographer wrote that she was a heroic painter, and she was notable because she actually, notable as a female artist, because there really weren't many female artists in the 17th century. You may have heard of Artemisia Gentileschi, or a little bit later, Angelica Kauffmann or Rosa Bonheur. What all of those female artists had in common is the fact that they trained in the studio of their father. So one of the reasons why we don't have that many female artists is because female artists weren't allowed to go to art training academies, and they certainly weren't allowed to draw live nude models, which is what how male painters trained. So Sirani trained with her father, who was an assistant to a very well-known Bolognese painter named Guido Reni. Other sort of Bolognese artists in that milieu were Guercino and Carracci. And surprisingly, or sort of tragically, Sirani had a very short life. She was only active for about 10 years. She died at age 27, but in sort of her 10 active years, she did about 200 paintings, many of which are mythological or religious in subject matter. She also did many paintings of Madonna and Child. She did 10 etchings and a variety of drawings. So if we take a look here at this sheet, what we're looking at are two kind of iterations of Mary Magdalene. And what's, I think, really interesting about looking at this sheet front and back is that we're seeing the artist's thoughts on paper. When we go to a museum and you see a painting, that's kind of the finished product. But if we sort of peel back the layers and look at the drawings that precede a painting, we can see the artist's attempts at different ways of showing the subject matter. And Mary Magdalene was particularly interesting in this respect because she, as we know from the Bible, is a follower of Jesus, and she's often equated with a woman in the Bible who was known as a sinful woman who came and washed Jesus's feet with her tears and wiped Jesus's feet with her hair. So she's seen as a penitent sinner, as a repentant woman who had a very sinful past. And some painters focus on the repentant part more, and some painters focus more on the sinful part. So if we look at two paintings that Sirani did of Mary Magdalene, we can see kind of that dichotomy. If we look at the next slide, we'll see a painting of her, sort of Mary Magdalene gazing outward, pointing towards a skull, thinking about death and mortality, and gazing beyond a crucifix. And we see her with her hand kind of clasped to her breast there. The next painting that Sirani did of Mary Magdalene is a rather different conception. We see her sort of arrayed in front of us, half nude, but tempered by these religious symbols. She has her hand pointing towards the Bible and resting on a skull and looking at a crucifix. And in the background, we have an instrument that could be used for self-flagellation. So here there's this very strong tension between saint and sinner. And then if we go back and look at the drawing, we see Mary Magdalene kind of two different ways. On the left side, we see her gazing downward and having her hands sort of demurely crossed over her chest. Her head's down, her hair is covered. It's a very sort of interior view of Mary Magdalene. And on the other side of the paper, if you flip it over, you see this other view, which is a bit more sort of fervent. And you see her almost sort of lovingly clasping this crucifix to her breast, and her hair is uncovered. So I think what we see here are two different ways that Sirani is thinking about showing the Magdalene. And then the question would be, well, why did we acquire this work? It's sometimes we play to our strengths, and in this case, we have a very strong painting collection, the Sweden Manning collection of paintings that are, we have a strong Italian Baroque section, and this fits right in with some of the works we have. We have a beautiful Porcino painting of Mary Magdalene. And we also have an etching by Elisabetta Sirani in the collection, which we can see on our next slide. So it's nice to have some work by her. So we have one Sirani, but we don't have a drawing. And it fits in with sort of the thrust of our early modern collection, but we didn't have this drawing. We have, in fact, if you, when you look at the bottom of the slides, you'll often see, if you flip back one slide, we'll see the credit line and the previous slide, sorry, go back. The credit line here is for the Stillwater Foundation. There's a very generous foundation in Austin that has supported important acquisitions for the Blanton over the last couple decades, several decades. And so we had funds from that foundation. And when I saw this drawing in New York, I discussed it with Carter, and we agreed that the condition was great and it complemented what we had. And frankly, it's not easy to find drawings by female artists from this period. So we were thrilled to be able to bring this one to our collection.
And I was interested in learning about this drawing, that there's roughly 120 known sheets by Elisabetta Sirani, so not that many. That's pretty small body of work. It probably reflects the fact that she died so young. But I should say that there's a professor in Texas named Babette Bone who's a specialist in Sirani. So she teaches at Texas Christian University, so we got her input on this as well. And that's often typical of what we do, especially when you're buying an old master drawing, what we call old master drawings. I guess that's a sexist term. Early modern European drawing. Yeah, so this was, and they're relatively inexpensive compared to especially contemporary art. So anyway, it was an interesting thing to buy. We have a couple of questions. One is, were there art subjects that were seen as typically female subject matter and male subject matter? And if so, when did women start breaking out of those stereotypical subjects? I would say in general, a lot of artists that were in that era were generally treating, I mean, this Sirani, like many figures from that era, was treating Catholic subject matter. She was Catholic, and a lot of the subject matter was determined by the Catholic Church if it wasn't religious or mythological. That said, as a female artist, I'm sure she gravitated towards a female saint. I don't know if any of that came up in your research, Holly.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to see, you know, and like an artist like Artemisia Gentileschi or Elisabetta Sirani, when they are doing images of powerful females, sort of the beheading of, you know, when Judith beheads Holofernes, art historians are really interested to see, do they look at it in a different way, or does it fit in with their biography? You're right, a lot of artists are just doing what they've been asked to do as a commission for a church, for an altarpiece, and I don't think you could necessarily say that her art looks decidedly feminine, but it could be also, like you said, she didn't have access to drawing nude male models, and so thinking about what subject matter would she have access to. But that said, you know, the highest genres, the best artists are doing multi-figure painting, history paintings and religious paintings, and she's doing that. So yeah. Female artists sometimes specialized in flower paintings or portrait paintings because they didn't have access to the training, whereas Sirani did, because she's trained in her father's studio, and she's, you know, competing at the same level as reputable and famous male artists.
So Karen Jacobs asks, she's interested in the materials, and were they hard to come by or provided by her father, who was her teacher? The materials were not, I mean, these are typical materials that you see artists drawing with, this sort of red chalk on paper with the brown wash. I don't know if we know exactly what kind of ink it was. I don't think it's iron gall, but it's very typical actually of this time period. So if you're an artist, the types of materials were well established and quite available. It would have been a cost issue, and paper was much more expensive then than it is now, but I don't think the other materials were uncommon. We have another question, which is, how was a drawing like this preserved for so long? That's a really interesting question. You know, paper is actually quite durable, and it's as long as it's doesn't get wet or get burned or, you know, have some other physical intervention, or bugs don't eat it. You know, it's these drawings were appreciated and collected by the end of the 16th century. People start collecting and preserving drawings. They tended to preserve them in albums and things like that. So if it was collected and preserved, it tends to survive if you know, people were taking care of it.
Yeah, and Elisabetta Sirani was also, you know, she was very well known and regarded in her era. So I think, you know, people were attuned to her, and they weren't throwing away these scraps of paper or something. That wouldn't have been how they were seen. And in, you know, workshops preserved drawings because those were kind of important preparatory materials for the next work of art that you might do on that same subject matter. So, I mean, in some ways it is amazing, right? That we have something, we've just acquired a work of art that was made in Italy in 1660, and now it's here living in Texas. I mean, it is kind of a miracle of survival when you step back and think about the big picture, but as Carter said, drawings have been valued for a long time and preserved by devoted collectors.
Did she get paid? Yeah, she would have gotten paid for her commissions, I'm sure. Yeah, for sure. Okay, yeah. Should we move on to the next artist?
Yeah. Let's move on. We are, and just so everybody knows.
Any more questions about Sirani? Here's one more. Let's see. When acquiring prints and drawings where are they typically found? That's a good question. And what are the steps towards acquisition? So there's a market for these works. There's a network of dealers, and people collect them. There's plenty of private collectors who collect drawings. So it's like anything. There's a network and pools of things. I mean, the old master drawing market has definitely shifted. I've watched it shift in my museum career, where things just become rarer and rarer because as things come on the market and get purchased, many of them go into museum collections and then they don't re-enter the market. So so that has been a shift recently. I think in the 50s and 60s, the old master drawing market was plentiful and you could buy much more significant drawings more easily. I'm sure there's still significant drawings out there, but it has shifted a bit. But like, I think Holly and I talk about this a lot. We feel like it's a bargain in early modern European, especially with prints, because prints are multiples, and just because the contemporary art market has been so overheated for so long, it's a really interesting area to buy in. And it also takes a specialized knowledge that people that are interested in contemporary art perhaps are less interested in the older art. In a way, it's unfashionable, I would say, which means there's opportunity.
Right, it's great for us because it's a way that we can add some really important works by well-known artists to our collection. You know, in this case, this Sirani drawing was from a dealer who was at print fair, actually. So sometimes we'll go to art fairs and, you know, there's certain gatherings. I mean, there's Master Drawings Week in New York, and then there's a famous sort of similar thing in Paris. So there are times when dealers gather and you can go and visit all these booths, but then it's also people send catalogs around, and there's a question of whether we buy from auctions. I mean, certainly these are sold at auction. Museums don't tend to buy at auction. There's a question here about the steps towards acquisition. We have a few steps towards acquisition. It has to go before an acquisitions committee for approval. And so buying something at auction doesn't, you know, it's a little harder to do that if you have to go through several steps beforehand. You know, we also have them, we want to buy them, we have it sent to us and we look at it to make sure that it is exactly what we expected and that the condition is good and everything too. So there are multiple steps.
When you're buying older art like this, you want to have a chance to do research on it and examine it physically. Those are two really important things to make sure the condition's okay. And then authenticity can be another issue, and that can be a consensus of scholars, and sometimes it takes a time to gather those opinions or whatever. So, I mean, fortunately, as I said, we have an expert on this artist locally, or in Fort Worth, so that made it kind of easy.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we're gonna now move forward about 300 years in history and talk about Elizabeth Catlett. So I'll just, again, do a little brief bio on her and then talk about this specific work. So Elizabeth Catlett was born in Washington, D.C. in 1915. And she studied painting at Howard University under some very famous African-American artists of the period, such as James Porter and James Wells. And then she went and she did an MFA at the University of Iowa, which is really interesting for the time period. She was the first woman to get an MFA from the University of Iowa, and also the first person to get an MFA in sculpture. So we're looking at a print, but Elizabeth Catlett is known, first off, as a sculptor. And at the University of Iowa, she studied with Grant Wood. And so pretty much everybody can call to mind that famous painting of the man and the woman in front of that white building with the pitchfork. That's who she studied with. And he encouraged her to work in the idiom that she knew. So paint and sculpt, common experience of what she knew. And then so after she graduated from the University of Iowa, she went to New York and Chicago, and it was in Chicago that she met the artist Charles White, and they got married. And so this is kind of where our story with Elizabeth Catlett picks up, because as Carter and I sort of talked through, who do we have in our collection and who would we like to have? Every museum's collection is very distinctive to that museum, and there are a couple strengths in our collection, particularly strong areas in our collection. One is that we have a really great collection of works by Charles White, which is a recent gift from the Gordon family to the Blanton, of drawings, paintings, and prints. We also have a really strong collection of Latin American prints, specifically Mexican prints. And yet we didn't have Elizabeth Catlett. And Elizabeth Catlett bridges the sort of the gap between Charles White and these Mexican prints. If we look at the next slide, so here's an example of Elizabeth Catlett's sculpture, which you can see definitely relates to the prints that we acquired. And then in our next slide, you'll see two artists who are very influential in her life. Charles White, that's a work from our collection. She was married to Charles White when she went to Mexico. Charles White may sound particularly familiar to you all because we recently had a fabulous paper vault show celebrating the Gordon gift, and with works from Charles White, and concurrently there was a show at the Christian Green Gallery on campus as well. And just a plug for another museum at home program, there's a virtual tour of the Charles White exhibition available on our website. And so if you didn't get to see it, you can actually walk through it and zoom in and look at every work and read every label there. So Catlett goes to Mexico with Charles White, and very quickly they get involved with a printmaking workshop there called El Taller de la Gráfica Popular. And that was a print collective with artists like such as Leopoldo Mendez and Pablo O'Higgins and Francisco Mora. And we have a work there by Francisco Mora for you to look at from our collection. And this was an artist collective that was very interested in sort of the liberation of all people and in having a social and political message via the use of printmaking, and very specifically woodcut and linocut. So economical, straightforward media, and with very bold and graphic lines. And so while she was in Mexico, Catlett actually separated and then divorced from Charles White, and she married Francisco Mora and stayed in Mexico pretty much for the rest of her life. She became a Mexican citizen. She taught at the Fine Arts School there. She taught sculpture and was a chair of the sculpture department, or chair of the Department of Sculpture at the Fine Arts Academy there in Mexico City. And then if we want to take a look at the work that we acquired, I think you can see kind of the milieu that she worked around. So you can, a constant theme throughout her work are the strength of African-American women and political struggle in America and in Mexico. And so I just love this print because I think it puts together these different parts of her life and these different connections in our collection. If you look over in the sort of the bottom right corner there, is one of our commenters asked, you see EC, which are her initials, and then TGP. So, and that's the print collective. And so this print is titled American Women Unite. And what we have is, I think you have North America, Central America, and South America joined, unite, distinct yet united. And then interestingly, the portrayal of the three of them mimics or is very similar to the portrayal of the Trinity in some European and colonial Latin American art. So where you are trying to, where artists are figuring out how do you show Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, or three in one, she's used sort of a similar composition here. And really the powerful lines of that woodcut technique match the strength and beauty of these women. And also if you think about the fact that she was a sculptor and she's sculpting in terracotta and she's sculpting in wood and carving wood, it's, it's a small step going from that kind of carving to carving a wood block. So I think you can see her.
And in fact, in the history of printmaking, printmakers were called sculptors back in, the 16th, 17th century. So because of the relationship to carving into the material. So sculpting and printmaking do have a relationship. And it's interesting that she's incredibly adept at both.
Yeah, exactly. And this is, you'll notice here that there are different colors. And so in order to do that, you have to basically carve a different block for each color and ink them separately and print them on top of each other. So there are multiple blocks involved in the production of this work. And so this was another work actually that I saw at Print Fair. And like I said, we've been on the lookout for a Catlett print. The value of her works has been steadily climbing. And so we wanted to move on something sort of quickly because she's one of those artists who has become more sort of sought after in collections. Her sculptures are very expensive, but prints are still affordable. And so again, we were able to turn to our generous foundational support from Stillwater Foundation and acquire this print this year.
And this is a little bit, this acquisition, I mean, she was literally on our list as a gap, like we wanted to work by her. She's a really well-known printmaker. And so this was, once you see something like this available and the condition's okay, and you know, you like the image, there's not much more to kind of, there's less to help you make up your mind. It was what we call a no-brainer. And this is also, she had a long career. She lived a really long life. So this does not preclude us getting another work by her. Probably we could easily we'd love to have a sculpture, but those are quite expensive, but we'd love to have another print. Her most famous print is a print called Sharecropper. That's from, I believe, the mid-40s. So it's a little bit earlier, but so she has quite a long career. So we'd be happy to have a more representative collection of her work.
Yeah, there's a question about how many prints were made of this one. I believe it was an edition of 40.
Any more questions about Catlett from our 61 participants? If not, I guess we can move on to the next artist.
Just so you know, in case you're new to Zoom, at the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A, if you click on that, that's where you can type in the questions. So in case people are wondering where the questions are coming from. So I'm going to pass this next one off to Carter because he was very closely involved in the acquisition process, and he's in fact virtually in the studio of the next artist.
My studio back, it's not my house, it's an image of Helen Frankenthaler's studio that is blurrier than I thought it would be. But this group of works, so we were, hold on. We were actually, I got a phone call one day, which is the kind of phone call you wish you got all the time, from a woman named Ruth Fine, who was a very well-known print curator. She was curator at the National Gallery for many years, and she's also herself an artist, so very well-known in our field. And she was hired by the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation to come up with a process for distributing some of her work to museums across the country. So there is a foundation. Helen Frankenthaler established a foundation before she died, and it's headquartered in New York, and it houses some of her work and her archive, but it also has quite a bit of money. She was a successful artist, but she also came from a wealthy background, so the foundation, I think, is quite well funded. And Ruth Fine identified museums across the country where I think she was especially interested in teaching museums, where there was active teaching from the collection, and she offered us, she said, would we be interested in having a gift of 10 prints plus a group of progressive proofs for one of the works? And that was like an easy answer, of course, because Helen Frankenthaler, I mean, we talk about expanding the canon and female artists, and someone like Elisabetta Sirani, who's certainly not a household name, but Helen Frankenthaler was successful very early on in her work. She was very well connected. She was married to another artist, a famous painter named Robert Motherwell. And she was famous especially for develop a staining technique in which she poured both oil, and later she also used acrylic paint directly on the canvas and introduced sort of chance processes. Worked on a very large scale, as you can see sort of from the background of my fake background. Thanks to the generosity of James Michener and his wife Mary, who really established a lot of our post-war collection, we had this wonderful painting by her in our collection, and we had a few other works, but we didn't have this whole series of prints. So the foundation, we ended up getting this nice gift of works on paper by Helen Frankenthaler, and we were really thrilled about it. And I think her prints are probably less well-known than her paintings. She worked in multiple techniques, but some of her prints are among her very best work, I think. And she was devoted to printmaking for a lot of her career. And it's nice to have the work of artists in depth in multiple mediums. So at the right, you're seeing a screen print, and on the left, you're seeing the painting that we have in our collection, which has been up a lot, and it's been down because it's been on tour in exhibit. There's several exhibitions that it was in recently. If we want to go to the next images, this is you want to talk about this, Holly? That's
One thing that's really fun about the selection of works that the Frankenthaler Foundation chose for us is they chose it from sort of the broad arc of her career and a variety of printmaking techniques. And when we're talking about artists like Helen Frankenthaler, who primarily are painters, I mean, sometimes they'll just sort of send a design to a print person, master printer who has to figure out how to make it. Helen Frankenthaler is very, very involved in printmaking, but she did work with master printers. And so when you kind of look at the captions, as we can kind of go through a few of these different ones, but you'll see there's different techniques. This is pochoir, which is sort of a stencil technique. And I was reading about this where she was working with assistants who are holding down basically a stencil and she's hand dabbing the ink. And so everyone's going to turn out, she makes a series of these or multiples, but you know, it's hand dabbed. So everyone's going to be slightly different.
it's almost like what we call a monotype, which is that is unique. This is not so much, it's less like the previous ones. The only thing that is continuous is I guess the pochoir shapes that she uses.
Yeah, so the way that the ink might squish underneath the stencil is going to be slightly different in every one. Yeah, we can look. We were given 10, and then the process proofs. We won't show all of those to you today, but we picked out a few to be able to show you a few different techniques. So we go on to the next one. This is a lithograph, which basically it's a stone that she's sort of painting on with a special kind of ink that then gets printed. And here she started experimenting with different colors of paper. And this one's called Bronze Smoke. And what's kind of interesting is what you'll see happening is, well, if you get the book on Helen Frankenthaler, you'll see that she might have tried this in 5 or 6 different color variations, and she didn't keep those ones, but what might look sort of deceptively simple as sort of 2 colors, she's tried in a variety of different iterations and different colors of paper, different ways of layering the different ones. And this one actually is just two colors. There's a color of the paper, and then there's a bronze color layer, and then there's this smoky brown color layer. Some of them actually get quite more complicated if we kind of go on to the next one. This is what Carter was just mentioning, a monotype. And I think what's really interesting to see is some of the connections between the different works that we're showing you. We looked at the Catlett was a woodcut, so we're carving into a piece of wood. Here, Frankenthaler is using a piece of wood and really enjoying the grain there. And this is a monotype, which means there's only one of these. She's just taken the piece of wood and inked it distinctively. And it's almost like creating a painting on top of the wood. And then you put it through the press and you come through the press and then you pull off your paper. And then you go back to your piece of wood and you can ink it completely differently the next time. And then I think the final Frankenthaler image that we have, the next one, is also on wood. But this one's kind of fascinating because the last one was one piece of wood inked differentially. This one is a 16 color woodcut from 9 blocks. So like we talked about, Catlett layered a few blocks to get those different colors. When you look at this and you try to describe the different sort of depths and hues and ranges of the purples and oranges in here, it really becomes sort of mesmerizing and fascinating. And you realize she's created 9 different blocks and she's blended 16 different colors to get this. And when we will be doing a paper vault show on Helen Frankenthaler, so when you get to see this in person, when we reopen, I think you'll just be blown away by how beautiful this work is and the deep saturation of color that she achieves.
Yeah, and our exhibition schedule is shifting around a bit because of we don't know exactly when we're going to reopen and things like that. But look on our website. We were definitely doing a show of her work from this wonderful gift that will contextualize it and show her along with some of her peers. And we have a real strength in abstract art in general, post-war abstract art, meaning art from the 50s, 60s, 70s, particularly the 60s and 70s. So this gift was really dovetails so beautifully with all that. And I just wanted to say that the Frankenthaler Foundation has been really wonderful at this difficult moment, providing grants to artists and finding ways to sort of help artists who, many of whom are losing income pretty drastically right now. So we love the Frankenthaler Foundation.
We do. I see just a question here about what is Toronoko paper. A lot of artists have used varieties of different Japanese papers. Even Rembrandt used Japanese paper. They have, there's a special sort of bush that grows in Japan called the Gampi bush, and the fibers that come from that are really, really smooth. It's interesting because here you get a lot of texture from the woodcut, but you're getting, it's purposely put on a very, very smooth paper that almost has a sheen to it.
And in printmaking, the type of paper used can be very important because the paper, it takes the ink in a very different way depending on the type of paper it is. And Western papers are very different than Japanese papers. So the types of paper that are traditionally used, in Europe and America. Let's see, we have a question from someone I know, Nana Smith. When we take in her abstractions, are we being asked to perceive a three-dimensional abstract space? Could you compare it to someone like Carmen Herrera? Oh, that's interesting. It's interesting, this issue of flatness that you bring up, because as I was researching a show that from our collection, the idea of flatness is so discussed in the critical language of the 60s. It almost seems ridiculous now to look back on it, but it was very, very serious. Like this idea of flatness being associated with an advanced form of painting. And Frankenthaler was really integral to all that because she was actually considered the first person who merged ground and medium, meaning the canvas and the paint become merged into one surface, which may sound simple, but that really was a very debated topic. And so, I think it's interesting. I think that you can have a type of painting where the surface seems impenetrable, but I wouldn't say that a lot of her painting is like that. It's very atmospheric and very liquid, and you're very aware. And I think you do bring layers. Whether she was trying to specifically create that, I think it depended on the painting actually. There's one more question about proofs and trial process. Do you see that?
Yeah, is it common for trial or process proofs to be made available to institutions and collections? Are they typically released when an artist passes away? I think they're usually part of the artist's, archive. And so depending on what happens to the archive, whether they all go to a museum together or whether, a collector tries to get all the process proofs. I don't know, what's your experience with that, Carter?
They do get out on the market. It depends. But I think like in the case of this gift, it's not surprising that they would have a bunch of the process proofs because they wouldn't normally be released. But I've seen definitely trial proofs and things like that become available on the market. It sort of just depends on whether the artist kept them or not. And if the estate wants to sell them, they certainly have value. And certainly print people like to geek out on the different proofs.
True.
Yeah. Should we go to the next?
Yeah,
we're running out of time, it looks like. My goodness.
Yeah, we want to make sure we get to this last artist who is finally getting her due. So we will switch and take a look at 3 works that we've recently acquired by this fabulous artist named Barbara Jones-Hogu. And so I think this is a really interesting connection back to Elizabeth Catlett. So we've got, we have an artist here, Barbara Jones-Hogu, who was born in the 1930s in Chicago and is a very Chicago-based artist. So she did go to Howard University like Elizabeth Catlett did, but then she came back to Chicago and she went to the Art Institute there. That's where she learned printmaking. And in 1968 was a formative year for her. She traveled to Mexico and actually met Elizabeth Catlett. But also in that year, she founded Africobra, the African Commune of Bad Relevant Artists, which was an artist collective. So we talked about Catlett being part of an artist collective, and so was Barbara Jones-Hogu. And this group of artists had ties to the Black Power movement, and also, like Catlett, they wanted to show positive and uplifting images and powerful images of the Black experience in America. And so part of the aesthetic amongst that group of artists was to have very colorful and vibrant images with rhythmic patterns and strong senses of movement. Barbara Hogu Jones she passed away in 2017, I believe. So relatively recently, and there was a show of her work in Chicago not that long ago, but and she was working up to, towards the end of her life. But the works we acquired from her from the sort of pivotal years in the around 1968, 69, and 70. And the common thread throughout them is her interest in the American flag and the portrayal of African Americans. And so if we look at this first slide has two images. One of them is called Land Where My Father Died. And in the bottom sort of 2/3 there, we can see a group of African Americans with fists raised with sort of a sign that we recognize as the symbol of Black power. And at the top, we have kind of a patchwork quilt of the American flag. And then the title, of course, is this sort of patriotic song, Land Where My Father Died. And in an interview with her, she said that, this was about thinking about what land did her father die in and what kind of life did he have in America. And when we look really closely at the flag, what seems as perhaps a patriotic gesture, we look closely at the stars and we see that in fact they are a kind of KKK uniform. And that's continued in the second image that we have here, where we see a group of African American men who are marching forward out of that background and being led by somebody in the front here. And about this work, she said that she was trying to reimagine what it could be like if groups of African American men who were perceived as dangerous or gang members joined together for good and were forces of positive social change in their neighborhoods. And then just to sort of show you the last work on our last slide here, we move from images of African American men to African American women. And this one's also called Nation Time. As we mentioned with Frankenthaler, this interesting use of paper, here Barbara Jones-Hogu has used this beautiful purple paper and has created an image where at the top there's this female figure, sort of almost like an omniscient female figure underneath which proliferates these other strong African American women. So the story of how this set came to our collection is a little different from the other ones. Carter had seen a great show and came to me and said, there's this great artist, Barbara Jones-Hogu, who I haven't seen before, but if you see her work, or could you figure out how maybe we could track down her dealer and acquire some works by her? So a friend of mine in the print world put me in contact with the dealer, and unfortunately Barbara had recently passed away and he was in charge of settling her estate, which and there wasn't a will, so there was a lot of complication there. And her son, who was the sort of the sole inheritor, also passed away. And so it was a very difficult time, and her dealer was very devoted to her and had been a champion of her work for a long time. And he then was trying to figure out how best to what to do with all of the works. And so a variety of museums had approached him because she had been in recent shows and had her own solo show. And so he set aside several works for the Blanton, and then we had to go out and find the money. And so in this case, we brainstormed about which supporters of our museum would really be most interested in these works. And on the bottom of the slides there, you can see the credit lines of some fabulous supporters of the Blanton and Austin and Houston who donated towards being able to bring these works to the Blanton, and that we're really thrilled to be able to share with you today.
What was interesting is that we after we really decided to go for it with this artist, we felt like we wanted to have multiple works by her because they were so strong. They were still relatively affordable. We felt like people are going to start going after her works because people are looking to diversify their collections. And she had been in a couple of really prominent shows recently. But we kind of had first pick because we were in there early. So it was really a wonderful experience getting these works. I don't see any questions about Barbara Jones-Hogu, but I think we're getting towards the end of our time. I hope everyone's had a nice drink and enjoyed looking at these works in our collection. One more minute for questions. I don't see any. Oh wait, here we go. Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. I'll let Holly wrap it up for us.
Well, I see some questions about Frankenthaler and so forth, but I'll say maybe we'll save it for the show. And we don't know how many more of these conversations we'll be doing. We're happy to circle back if there's a burning desire to know more about her too. I will say that'll be it for tonight's conversation. A few reminders, our next curated conversation that's called Filling Gaps and Finding Gems, Curator Q&A on modern and contemporary acquisitions will be next Tuesday. So same time, same place, come back here. To see our permanent collection online, to take those virtual tours of Charles White and others, and enjoy more ways to hashtag museum from home with the Blanton, go to the blantonmuseum.org/museum from home. If you're not a member, please consider joining for special perks and to support the museum at blantonmuseum.org/membership. Or if you'd just like to subscribe to our email newsletter so that you know when these other great events are happening, please sign up at blantonmuseum.org/subscribe. And then finally, if you have topics that you'd like us to cover in future curated conversations, just drop us a line at info@blantonmuseum.org. So thanks again, and we really hope to see you next Tuesday.
Thanks everyone, bye.
Bye, thank you.